welcome to episode 4 of Lakeview Listens. My name is Zachariah Schmidt. I'm the administrative assistant and communications coordinator at Lakeview Lutheran Church. I'm also your host for our podcast, Lakeview Listens, which we are just 4 episodes in, so really just starting out. So we are rapidly approaching the end of 2023, and with the end of the year, we start to really get into the holidays. And for a lot of people, I think the holidays can be a source of celebration and joy. And also for a lot of people, they can be a time of great sadness and reflection. And for a lot of people, kind of somewhere in between. But as Pastor Liala and I were talking about what we wanted the next episode of this podcast to look like, and as we were getting into the end of the year, we figured November would be a really good month just to kind of remember some of the folks at Lakeview that have gone before us and that have really provided a lot to the Lakeview community over years and years. November we have All Saints and Veterans Day and Thanksgiving, so just seemed like a really good time to remember some of these folks. So I'm here with 3 people today who have been very intimately involved at Lakeview over the years. So just wanted to let you guys kind of introduce yourselves, and then we can kind of get into it. Liala, if you want to go first.
So I'm Pastor Liala Beukema, and I obviously am pastor at Lakeview Lutheran Church.
I'm Nadine Zelle, and I've been a member, I think, 25 years. Become a long-time member.
And I'm Joe Crosby, and I have been going to Lakeview Lutheran since 2005. I have been, what haven't I done really in some capacity, even being on the church council for a while. I came to the church when I first moved into Lakeview Lutheran's basement, where they had a men's emergency homeless shelter.
Great. Good. Well, thank you guys for being here, and I'm looking forward to hearing some of the memories and some of the stories of these people. So maybe we can start out with Sandy Moore. I don't know when Sandy first came to the church. Maybe you could kind of give us a background of Sandy, but knew Sandy for most of my life, and I think for Sandy and for these other people that we'll talk about, I think one of the big things is just that they had such a presence at the church, and that they were always just there as part of fixtures of Lakeview and of the community around Lakeview. So yeah, if we could just kind of get an idea of who Sandy was outside of Lakeview and as part of Lakeview, I think that would be great to hear.
Well, go ahead. Do you want to start?
No, go ahead.
No, I was going to say, and in some ways, she represents a lot of the folks that we're going to talk about. Sandy came to Lakeview early 60s, and she had experienced a significant traumatic period of her life where she was in an automobile accident and lost her husband and her unborn child, and her body had just bones broken. But if you knew her, she was one of the most kind and generous and gracious and gentle people, unless you crossed her, people
Yes.
that you might ever meet. And so kind of, in some ways, kind of represents a lot of us who bring into this space stories of trauma and recovery and how those things bring people together. So she was there for a long time. She became the matriarch in some ways. She was the one that knew everybody and everything about everybody, and she kind of held the stories of that of her time here. So.
Yeah, I had no idea she was at she had been there since the 60s.
Since the early 60s. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, that's quite a long time. Yeah.
And we were lamenting the fact that we didn't collect her stories.
Mm-hmm.
So
Yes.
many of the stories.
Yes, very
and
much
so this is one way, the podcast, that we are doing that, and Joe's going to continue to write all the stories. But I think Sandy, every time you talk to someone who's been to Lakeville when Sandy was alive, they know Sandy and ask about Sandy.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yes.
And Sandy was the most welcoming person that everyone knew. Like I just said,
Yeah.
Yeah.
that was their entry into Lakeview, is
Sure.
Sandy Moore. And Joe, I think you should tell your story about Sandy.
I first got acquainted with Sandy when she would sit in the office downstairs, which was just, and the men's shelter part was just passed. And going up and down the hallway to the bathroom most of the time, it was like, hello. And then one time I had gone to Ash Wednesday services at church. And it was the following Sunday, I don't know whether it was the following Sunday or Sunday after that, I went to just regular services. And Sandy came in and, oh, hello, Joe, how are you? Hello, oh, good, you came to church. And she sort of like took me under her wing to help me, you know. It was my first time there. Showed me the hymn and everything and how it all worked. And at that time, they used to say, stand up and introduce yourself. And I said it was Zach's sister who had this basket with little prices in it. And I said, Sandy elbowed me and said, tell him, introduce yourself. I said, I don't want to. Sandy, I don't want to. No, introduce yourself, you get a prize. I said, Sandy, I don't think they want to hear that I live in the basement here. Oh, they won't mind, but you get a prize. So I stood up and introduced myself. And Sandy afterwards took me back to the coffee hour part. And it made sure I met Diane Holland, another member of the church, who was greeting people and kind of like coordinating. And that's how I met everybody else, actually, because I remember it was Bob and Mary Matta who came sort of like, it was like they'd been waiting. And it was sort of like watching, you know, new vultures with new blood come up and introduce themselves. And I was so happy, they were so happy you're here. And Tim Carlmark, who was a church council president, came over and introduced himself. And, oh, you're from the shelter. We're so glad you came upstairs. And is everything all right down there? Do you need anything? And I said, I had been living with other homeless guys and not having contact with regular people. And I got so nervous, I finally left before I freaked out completely about all these people showering all this attention. But it was like, and I kept thinking to myself, you people didn't understand I live in your basement right now and keep all my stuff coming from a Bus Depot background from a suitcase storage area from the old Greyhound Depot. And it was like, you know, Sandy started that. And then afterwards, I would be going by to talk to her at meetings at the church. And I'd like to go sit in the office to Sandy, and she would talk about people and tell stories about, you know, this person and that person and what was happening. And it was like, you know, it was like almost like a mother figure in some ways.
Sure.
In that
Sure.
respect. Other amusing story I didn't tell was one time upstairs, they were having a concert, I don't remember what, a string group or something. And they had set up wine in the background, and Sandy was operating the wine table back there. Which I don't know why you people let her do that. And I was standing back there talking. It was her and Mary Matta. And Mary was sipping on a glass of wine, and Sandy said, here, have a glass of wine. I said, well, you know, I have to go back downstairs, so I can only have one. Oh, that's right, well, you know, you can have one. And so she poured a glass of wine. I had to stop her because the glass was only half full before she filled it completely. And I was standing there talking, and every time I turned around, I would see, you know, every time I turned back around, that glass would be up to the point I drank it. It would be
Like a
filled back up.
miracle.
It was like, yeah, it was like a miracle. And I finally said, she said, here, you need a little bit more. I said, Sandy, I told you I have to go back downstairs. I cannot drink that much wine, or I won't be able to stay. Oh, honey, don't worry about it. If they throw you out, you can come stay with me. I said, well, of course, Sandy had been filling her glass regularly too by this time. And I said, well, I appreciate the offer, but don't you think Henry might want to have a say in that decision? She looked at me and said, who? I said, Henry, you know, the one you lived with. Oh, him. She thought a minute and said, don't worry about it, probably 2 or 3 days before you notice that you're there all the time anyway. And it was like, you know, just things like that, stories like that have stayed in my mind. And that was like in 2005, 2006, you know, but those, about Sandy.
Yeah.
Stories like that. And
Sure.
she used to be a wealth of information about other people, other church members, current and past,
Yeah.
Yeah.
Sure.
and everything like that.
I think it was, she was just the presence, the welcoming presence.
Right.
To everyone who would come into church. And we were lamenting the fact that we did not collect her stories. So appreciating the podcast and various ways that we need to do that, because it's important to collect these.
Yeah.
And
And I think for her, this wasn't just community, it really was family. I mean,
Right.
that was
Exactly.
as sincere, it didn't feel insincere, and it didn't feel desperate. It was just like, this was family to her, and everyone could feel that care and love, and I think that was just a real contributing factor to how that energy stayed present, as a lot of different things would change. And then to have a shelter on the lower level, and to have people there was that kind of sense of it wasn't a separate thing, and people who lived downstairs were still part of the family. And so I think that you would come up, or other people would come over the course of time, and at Sandy's beckoning throughout the week was just an affirmation and an encouragement to feel that sense of invitation, and normalcy, and humanity and dignity. She didn't treat anybody any different, whether it was the bishop, Bishop Hansen at the time, the whole bishop of the whole Lutheran Church, or Joe Crosby from the shelter. Everybody was treated with the same kind of love and care.
Exactly.
Yeah, and I think just what you mentioned at the beginning, a little bit of her story, just to come from a place of such tremendous pain and hurt, and be able to give so completely of yourself, and to be so gentle and kind and loving is just an incredible thing. That she was able to give the congregation and give the community at large, and just anyone who walked through that door. There wasn't distinction between whether you were first time or whether you were coming from the shelter or whoever it was. She was there, and she was present and welcoming.
I used to sometimes wonder how she got any work done, because the restrooms were at the end of the hallway, right past your office, and the guys from the shelter would stop and, "Hey Sandy, how are you?" And she always would stop and chat a moment, And I often wondered, there might be 2 dozen guys that stayed there, and at times there might be, she might get, maybe a dozen people would stop and say hello, and I always wondered how she got any work done. By that way, but she always stopped to talk. She was never too busy.
But that was the work, I think, for her. To be that. She always would, she was very generous. And at one point in time, I said to her, "Sandy, I do not want you to give people money, because there are 2 dozen people down there, and there's so much need, and not everybody, comes from, a similar space. And you just can't give. I can do. It's my money. I can do it." I said, "Listen, in this space, I'm the boss. So I'm telling you, if I find out you give people money, I will fire you. I will fire you." And she said, "You would never." And I said, "Just let me find out." Just let me find out that you don't give her money. And she never tells. She probably did, but
she went out in the parking lot and gave them
She probably did. She probably did.
Go see where Liala is, and then come back and find you. Attitude about the
That
whole thing.
mean girl.
Yeah.
Great. Well, yeah. So Sandy is one that I definitely remember over the years that had such a large presence. I wanted to talk also about Mike Cedarberg, because he's got another one that I remember from very early on that was there was always such a presence, and would always make such an effort to come up and talk to me every Sunday that we were there. And I remember going over to his house, me and Dad watching a baseball game and having pizza at his house, and just being there, and interacting with people and being a presence. So yeah, again, if maybe you want to give a little bit of a background as to who Mike was and how he came to the church.
I don't know. Do you know how he
I
came
don't
to
know
the
how he
church?
came to the church.
I think he.
Or maybe how long,
Yeah.
when does anyone know when he came to the church, or was he just kind of always there?
I think he might have come when Dennis Lordson was
I
there.
think so too.
And he was very interesting because he would be at the back, always at the back, and very kind of reserved in many ways, close to the cuff, but also just ever present and ever kind and ever, wanting to engage. I don't know, those are my memories of Mike.
So people would say, kind of like, I would say something about Mike Cederberg, and they would say, I don't know who that is. I said, oh, he's the really tall guy that looks like he just rolled out of bed.
Yeah.
Right? Because he
Yeah.
was a teacher, and then he was a counselor on the south side. But on Sunday morning, you just kind of, his hair was like crazy. A bedhead, kind of like, and I said to him one time, because I ran into him somewhere else, and he actually had a shirt and a tie on, and I almost didn't recognize him. He goes, that's what I have to do all week long when I come on the weekends, I just, whatever. But to your point, he knew, if he knew things, he remembered things about everybody. One of those people to say, how's Zachariah doing in school, or how's Grace doing in school, or like to somebody like Lisa, how are the Steelers doing? So he had that way of just kind of remembering things and making you feel like you had been seen and and heard.
Yeah, as a counselor does,
As a
right?
counselor,
To realize that he was a counselor all those years in Chicago public schools in many different, very difficult places, but he had that presence as well, just kind of a caring, accepting, empathetic.
I think it's interesting because I was in Atlanta when he passed, but I remember being on Zoom for his memorial service, and not always, but I think very often it's the people who are most under the radar in the back, like you were saying, very quiet, who have such this huge impact on the community around them. And so I remember listening into this memorial and just hearing all these other people outside of the church talk about his impact and all the things that he was doing in the church and outside of the church. And it's just incredible to hear all these stories from all these different people who knew him. Again, not just from the church, but from all the other work that he did in the world.
There was kind of like an unassuming quality to him. Like he didn't do things to get all of that accolade. In fact, he kind of really shied away from that. He was just doing what he needed to do because he loved doing those kinds of things. And then when you realize, he has this huge, community. He has an impact on the larger aspect of community, right? So I was a little dumbstruck because he just, he was bedhead Mike, just on Sunday morning. And then he was like on this board and that board, and he'd raise this kind of money and just had an incredible connection to people.
Sure.
Yeah.
Do any of you have any other specific memories about specific stories about Mike, or is it more just kind of a general?
I don't remember. I had seen him at church. I never did know him that well. I just chatted with him at church at one time. When I was living at Leland and Racine, I had been, it was during summer, I think I might have been coming back to the beach, and I was walking up Leland West, and there at the corner, on the building at the corner, somebody came down and opened the gate, and I turned around, and it was Mike Cederberg. And I don't know who's the most, gobsmacked, really, because he stood there and looked at me, and I looked at him, and he said, "What are you doing here?" I said, "Well, I live over there." He said, "Well, I live right here." And that had been, and how long have you lived up there? Do you come this way often? I said, well, no, apparently not often enough, you know, but anyway, and it was just like, and we had this really nice conversation about the neighborhood. And then he said he had to go someplace. I said, well, I think I've been through it, so I like to go home and get into the shower, you know. But it was like, you know, and that's about the only time I ever really, I think that was the only time I ever saw him out of the church. And I didn't know, you know, there again, and it was like 3 blocks away. And we'd never run into each other before.
You know, we were talking about not too long before he passed away, he came into church. He was the treasurer for a little while, and I said something to him about how you doing. He goes, well, not so great. I was just at the doctor and I found out that I have this, you know, heart thing. You know, it's hereditary. And I'm like, I said, wow, that sounds kind of serious. He goes, oh, it's no big deal. I mean, what can you do? You know? And I think he was a little bit, you know, anxious about it, or it kind of struck him because, again, he was very athletic and he took care of his body, and yet he wasn't going to let that dictate to him how he was going to live his life. He was just going to, you know, what can you do?
Right. Well, it's another maybe sort of way that it was just him saying it's not about me.
Right.
You know, it's about what I'm doing, and it's what I'm giving out into the world, and what I'm giving to my community.
Yeah.
So Sandy and Mike, and then I don't know if we want to maybe talk about Joe Vaughn a little bit. I don't remember. Yeah, I don't remember Joe that well. Like I remember him seeing him around, but I never really had any kind of one-on-one relationship with him. But if you want to speak about Joe Vaughn
how
for a
much
little
time
bit.
you got?
Yeah.
Really, he's only one. I always said that in my life, dating back to high school, I had what I finally classified as the brother I never had. There were just certain people, certain guys along the way. For some reason, I never, instinct, chemical, or what, when we got together, it just clicked. And Joe Vaughn was one of those people. We met at the shelter, and it was one Saturday. They were getting ready to close after breakfast. And it was like, what are you going to do then? And he hadn't been there very long. And I said, I said, well, I'm going to go down to the zoo and see the baby marmoset or something like that, you know. And, oh, okay, or, you know, and we were getting ready. And he walked up to me and said, excuse me, did you say you were going to the zoo? I said, yeah. I said, yeah, you want to come along? If it's all right, I kind of like that. And so I stopped to talk to somebody, and pretty soon he came back with a tap me on the shoulder. I was getting ready, and I tapped him. He said, are you still going to the zoo? I said, yeah. I said, well, then let's go. And we spent the whole afternoon together, and that's how it started. And we just, you know, we talked. We would talk, and we would share experiences. And I said, I found out later I didn't need to, one of the regrets of my life was when he was living upstairs in the choir loft. I had moved to the YMCA at that time, and I worked for almost 2 years to convince him to come over to the YMCA where there was nothing wrong. He just needed somebody to kind of like be around and look after him a little bit, mother hen along the way, and we kind of like did that for each other at times. And I worked for 2 years, and it would be like I would talk about this to at least go over and apply and see what could be done. And it would be like he would talk to you about this, and I said, you called it going to Joe's happy place. It would be like watching an iron curtain come down. And he would look at me and say, Joe, I will take care of that, eventually. In time, I will take care of that. And that's as far as it went. I never got him over there. And it never went, you know, it would be like up close and too personal. He would just shut down completely. That way. But, and then when basically the landlady threw him out, no offense, that's one thing. I lost contact with him. I couldn't find him, where he went or what had happened to him. And then I was telling, we had gotten word somehow that he was in the hospital. And was in bad shape, and he was not going to pull through. And I said, we went down to be with him there at the end. But the story was that this had been almost 4, maybe 3 years later. we found out we were going through his things because he had died. But we weren't immediate family. They wouldn't release the body to find out what could be done with it. And we were going through some of the things he left upstairs. And it was in a gym bag sort of thing. There was this little notebook, spiral notebook, like it used to be 10-cent notebooks. And in this notebook were these names and numbers, and they were all gone. And I said, turned around the line, I said, I wonder if this could be family or something. And we called and found out that he had a huge family. And his father was still alive, and he, not only that, he was a grandfather. And then all the time he'd never mentioned, and I knew that his mother had died young, when he was young, but he'd never mentioned any of the family here.
I do remember that. I do remember hearing that no one knew about this huge family that he had. And,
Was he one of 7 children, 6
Something like that. But they had lost, he obviously had some mental illness. And he had been, somehow he had lost contact or chosen not to have contact. They didn't know where he was for 10 years. And so when we were able to call them, they were so pleased and relieved that he had community.
Right.
And there were people and that we could connect. It was, and we had this big luncheon and celebration, and it was really wonderful.
I can remember going to that, and it was almost like being at a wedding because his family was on one side, and church members who had showed up were sort of like on the other side, and they were sort of like looking at each other like this. But it was fine,
Yeah. But I was going to say, there was Joe Vaughn, and then we talked a little bit about Frank Nichols. It was kind of an interesting, again, dynamic of people who, kind of find their way to this space, and it becomes so important and meaningful. Like Joe, when he lived, it wasn't a legal living, but he was living upstairs. He really had a lot of ownership about that space, and would clean or would kind of keep an eye out on things. And Frank Nichols would, the stories, he was another like unassuming person, and yet had so much ownership and pride about that space. You would come in on Sunday morning and Frank had, mopped the floor, and your eyes would burn with, with pine saw. And so it's kind of phenomenal. Whether it's an energy of the people that gets that permeates into the bricks and mortar there. But there's just something about it that's really beautiful and hopeful in some ways. And everybody had a story, and a lot of people had been through some traumatic. So it was a real place for healing and maybe redemption in some ways for some people. Maybe a little reunion for people.
It's a home. It's acceptance, right? It's acceptance.
When you mentioned with Frank and the floor scrubbing, one of my memories of Joe Vaughn, and it's something that happened, I'd say 2 or 3 years, is I had gone to the grocery store to get dishwashing liquid, and I was looking for grapefruit, and it was pink. Well, I just wasn't paying attention, and I picked up this one and brought it home, and after I got it home and looked, I thought, that's the wrong color pink, and it was like Japanese cherry blossom scent or something, and I used it, and the one thing that came to mind was Siobhan used to get that cheap aerosol stuff.
Oh, yeah.
And spray it around the sanctuary.
Yeah.
And it would literally, I could feel, he would spray that stuff, and it would always be something like lavender and vanilla, or, some really heavy, sweet-smelling scent, or cherry blossom, or something like that. And you'd walk upstairs and walk into the sanctuary, and I could feel my sinuses just kind of like, all at one time. It would be just like sickeningly sweet. It smelled horrible, really.
Yeah. But I can't open a thing of pine sol without thinking about Frank Nichols. I can't smell those smells, in another arena without it bringing me right back to those people.
Yes, I know, exactly. But I said, after all these years, still, that when I smelled that stuff, that's the first thought that came to my mind was the way that sanctuary would smell.
Sure.
Yeah. After he had sprayed this stuff up there.
Yeah, well, I think what you were just saying about the physical space of the church holding all these things is just, and I was just talking with Maggie the other day, and just there's very few places, I think, in society that have the kind of significance of a church, and have the power of gathering people together, and for so many people to be able to be vulnerable and open and share their share their stories and share their vulnerabilities in a space like that. And it's just pretty incredible to know that there are still spaces like that, even if they're dwindling. There are spaces like that.
Definitely.
Yeah.
I was just going to say, and we haven't talked about John Erlinger, which is
Oh,
the trio of you, but it's another of that time period of Joe Vaughn and
Right.
John, and the idea again, I mean, it's similar with Joe, that we're learning what stories. Sometimes people shared their stories and sometimes they didn't, but they knew, everyone knows it's a place where you can be, right? And that you're accepted. And there's loving kindness.
Yes, exactly. It's like it goes back to Sandy. Oh, the
Yeah.
place, it didn't matter.
Yeah,
It was like I was living in the basement. I had nothing.
yeah.
And it didn't matter.
And this, I was going to say, going back to Joe Vaughn, before we get to John, we were around his bed at the hospital, and it was such a moment
Yes.
that, to watch a person, we knew he was going to die, watching the monitor. And we were all, this collection, again, not necessarily of church members, but this collection of people who cared for each other in this place, to be together, to say goodbye and to be there with him when his family couldn't be, even, but it was there, for him and for us to be able to know.
In fact, I don't know whether you remember this or not, we were gathered around, and I don't know whether it was a resident or a doctor that came in and said, "Are you people family?" Well, how you going to explain to somebody?
Yeah.
And Liala sort of like, well, we're just from, and you kind of explained to him what was happening and what was there. And I can remember him saying, I think I might like to be in a church like that sometime.
Yeah.
I remember you bought it. I don't know whether it was, but I can remember him saying that. I was saying, that's nice. I think I might like to be in a church like that, have a family like that.
Yeah.
You mentioned John. Do you want to speak
Well,
someone?
and you talk about
John Erlanger.
Yeah.
I said this is the case. I was going to add that the churches where these people should be for all time, really. John Erlanger was the other one in that category. The brother I never had. And I think there might have been some meddling by a Lutheran pastor involved in this one when we managed to meet. But there again, it was this, like, we sat and chatted one time. He was at the front desk in the shelter bar. I come by to see her. And I don't remember how come, but anyway, I sat at the desk I think I had to go to another meeting. It wasn't time to leave and come back, so I just sat and talked to him. And we chatted, and we ended up, he was about a year behind me. When I had moved to the LakeView YMCA, and he was about a year later. Then when I moved to Leland and Racine, he was about a year later, and he lived across the hall from me for, 2 years, And we did things. We talked. I always said that I told that one more so than with Joe Vaughn, but with John, it was like John would tell me things and talk to me about things, and I would do the same with him. That nobody else would ever. We would not consider doing that with anybody else.
Yeah.
That way, and it's like. But that was the other one, and they both came to the shelter. That was,
And his readings, I don't know if you remember when he read in church.
Oh,
It would
yes.
just bring tears to our eyes and his eyes. It would just be such a moment, right?
So heartfelt. I mean,
Yeah.
it really came from deep places.
Yeah.
Yeah.
The one thing that fascinated me about John, and it used to infuriate me, and it fascinated me, I had to resist the urge, was John could be charming, witty,
Oh,
tell wonderful stories,
storytelling.
until he started drinking. And he would reach that point when he drank that he would turn dumpster drunk stupid. And I used to worry about him getting out when he would be like that. all that would be gone, and it would just be gibberish and nonsense, you know.
Yeah.
All that would be gone, and it would be like, you know, totally opposite of what he was otherwise. And I used to worry about him getting out and on the streets, going, you know, for fear he'd get hurt or get arrested or something, you know, when he would be that way. But it was fascinating. I used to be fascinated to watch. In fact, I had to resist the urge sometimes to encourage him to drink more, so he would be that way to watch him, compared to the other times.
Just the way he managed his pain. I could always tell because when he was in a good place, he'd call me Dutch. Hey Dutch, how you doing? Hey Dutch, I have a little cartoon one time that he gave to me still. Hey Dutch, but then when he was not in a good place, he'd call me Pastor. You know?
Well,
Pastor.
that's so nicer than all the things he used to call me. But that's a totally different conversation. And I call him some things too, but anyway, that's a totally different conversation.
There you go.
Yeah, well, I guess that's the other thing that just came to mind when I was saying about people coming in and bringing their vulnerabilities is that you see in these spaces people bringing their best selves, but then you also see them in their darkest places too. You know, it's
Exactly,
a combination
yes.
of both things, like you were just saying
And it
with
was
John.
fortunate that he could, I don't know how else, it was fortunate that he felt he could be that way with me.
Yeah.
You know?
Yeah.
And he used to say one time, when I grow up, I'm going to be just like you. And I say, well, when you put on the long pants, we'll talk. You know? Anyway, just stories like that.
Yeah.
You know? But when he lived across the hall, especially, he would invite me to his place, and I would invite him to mine. He says, no, I don't want to go over there because it's not really safe in your house. Well, I was always involved with, I would be knitting or I would be sewing, I would always be involved in doing something, you know, and there was stuff spread around. And it would be sort of like he'd come in and kind of like shrink down this way. I don't know what he thought was going to happen, was somebody's going to grab him or what. But anyway, he always said that it was not really safe to come to my house.
Yeah.
But I would go to his, he would come and knock on the door, slip a note under my door. We did a lot of notes slipping under the door. Come over for coffee, I want to tell you something, you know, or something like that, you know.
Yeah.
And we had the same case manager one time, Nanette, at the shelter. And we both had her, but anyway, I moved on. Anyway, I used to tell Nanette, I said, you know, you should feel really lucky because you could have had John Erlanger and I on your caseload when we were both drinking.
Yeah.
That way. It wouldn't have been, you know, pleasant at all. I can remember one time, I don't know how it came up, worried about getting man boobs. And somebody told him it looked like it was developing man boobs. I don't know how it came up, but anyway, I went home and looked up what gynecomastia is the technical medical term for it. And I can remember writing on the card, I wrote down what it was, the definition, and I put down the bottom, AKA man boobs, and slipped it under his door. And he went to the shelter and told him. And I remember hitting Nanette, his case manager, he showed me, she said, you know, he showed me that note. I said, the note, she said, the one about the man boobs? I said, he brought it over here and showed it to, yeah, he showed it to a couple of people over here. As she said, I'll warn you now, he's not happy about that. But anyway, you know, he told me later, he says, I'm going to come over to your house someday. I am going to come to your house someday, and if I find that damn dictionary, I'm going to burn it too.
Yeah.
That's why I over that. But,
Yeah. I think he's kind of one of those, I mean, it was such a wonderful, I mean, there was aspects of him that were so, again, generous, he was funny, he was so smart. He was a great cook. He was one of those people where you thought to yourself, there isn't anything he couldn't do if he could, you know, make friends with his, you know, with his demons,
yeah,
right?
With the demons and everything.
But then it's also, we were talking about this earlier too, in terms of the great part of this dynamic is that for those of us who befriend folks, and maybe people who befriend us as well, there was that moment where you just realize, I can't change somebody, I can't fix somebody, I just have to love them. No matter where they are or what stage they are or whatever that means. And then sometimes it means that you have to let them go.
Exactly,
You know?
yes.
And that can be really painful.
It is really, yes.
But that's kind of the thing about love, right? Is if you love it,
It's not supposed to be easy.
it's not supposed to be. It's not always easy.
No.
Yeah.
And it's not really supposed to be that easy. If it's that easy, there's
He's
something
like a
wrong.
treasure.
It
He's
is.
a
If it's easy that way, there's something wrong someplace, to me anyway.
Maybe.
But I said, it's interesting because so far after John Erlanger died, and I moved into a different building, and there's nobody there like that for me now, and it gets kind of lonesome at times. Because I still think at different times, well, let me go talk,
Yeah.
it's not across the hall
Yeah.
that way.
Yeah. Indeed.
But they've been, I said, they both came from the shelter. And one of the things about Lakeview Lutheran and that shelter was I met people down there, like John and Joe and a couple of others that came through the shelter that under regular circumstances, I doubt if highly doubt our paths would have ever crossed, or we'd have never, we might have said hello and just chatted sociably and walked away.
And for the people at the church as well, right? That the people at the church are getting to know people they wouldn't normally
Exactly.
have the chance
there
to
again,
understand or hear stories of lives that are different from ours. And from,
I met, I said, Liala and I grew up at the church together, really. She got there about a month or two before I did, before I came into the shelter, and I said that, there again, our paths would have never crossed, probably. Or the paths would have never crossed. I knew I can remember when you were about this high. You're not supposed to be like that.
Do we want to talk a little bit about the Mattas just before we wrap up? I don't know how brief that would be, but I figured when we think about Lakeview's history, especially in the past 20, 30, 40 years, Mattas are pretty big fixture.
Yeah. And I was thinking with the Mattas, now we've become the Mattas. Because when we first came, the Mattas were the elders, or the people have been there, and now here we are, with this history and the stories. And I think part of what the 175th celebration was able to do for me, in particular, I was able to dig into all these stories, and, as we're talking about, all of the people we talked about so far today, and you think that was happening, or on the shoulders of the Mattas and the people before them, and just the beauty, and there's always been that space, that safe space for people to continue. And enough people, it's not always been this huge amount, but enough people to call this their home and want to continue it and want to be there for each other in whatever way we can. So from the Mattas, I know when I came, when John and I came, the Mattas, well, first there was Sandy welcoming us, and then we met the Mattas, when Bob was Bob Matta, and Paul, his brother, the gruff old German, but still this heart of gold, right? Norwegian, thank you.
Please.
I was going to say, watch
sorry.
yourself
I
there.
want to get home.
And then, Marine, or you think of that whole crew, and then just reading the stories of how Lakeview was what we're saying, home for them, and how
I'm sorry. Go ahead.
that's all.
I thought I heard one time that Bob and Mary Matta met when they were Sunday school students there.
Oh yeah, Bob Matta was baptized in the church.
So
he knew no other,
You know who met there? Their kids. I think Bob and Mary's son met his wife at Sunday school.
Little
really?
Paul.
Yeah, and
I
now
can't
they're
remember.
in their 60s or something.
Yeah.
Anyway, yeah.
But I thought I could remember. I always said the one story about Bob Matta that I remember was he'd always been friendly and everything. And one Sunday, I got recruited to help with the collection. I'd never done that before, and Bob was
Very clear.
Bob said, follow me. And I can remember we got done and we went down to the front, and I turned, the front pews on my side were empty. There was not, and I just turned around and started back, and he told me later, you did good, except that when you take collection like that. You always want to go down to the front before you turn, all the way down before you turn around, because that gives them time to get their money out. Nothing religious about it. It was just that it gives them time to get the money out. You know? And it was like, you know,
Yeah.
well, I always remembered that after that. Anyway,
Very practical.
Yeah.
just very, very much that way.
Any other thoughts about the metas, or anyone else you can?
Well, they were just, and I just know at the end, they were driving, how far?
Watsika.
From Wasi, 2
I
hours?
remember
Oh
that
my
was,
God.
yeah.
Like every Sunday, you know, I mean, they're just so, the presence,
Yeah.
the physical presence always
Right,
there,
yeah.
you know, even into the later years. So, you know, they were just,
Yeah.
yeah.
Again.
And Mary, I found out in one of the 175th, I mean, she documented everything, you know. And this is just a beautiful thing that we have to continue, is documentation and story collecting, and for those that
Sure.
come in.
I remember Sandy was telling me about where they lived out there at one time back when it flooded. And that they had, Bob and Mary had to evacuate. As they stayed in some church's basement and slept on cots and everything. And it was the next Sunday at church, she was standing at the back, kind of back over, almost hiding in the corner, said she had started a cold. But I went back and I told her, I said, you know, it's all right, you can come in. Because I said, this church here, they like people who live in shelter. They kind of like that area. And she kind of reached out and hit me on the arm and said, how did you know about that? But I remember she said, I thought about that when we was, they were on camp cots. And said she was helping Bob settle down before she got settled down. She said, I thought about you guys, you have to do that every night, don't you? I said, yeah, we did every night. We don't get camp cots, we're on foam mattresses on the floor. I said, yes, we do that every night. That's, she said, that's incredible. We were over there, I don't know, a week or something like that. She says, I was totally exhausted.
Yeah.
I said, well,
Yeah, and they were key in having the shelter at the church, because, you know, in the early 80s, it was a PADS program, so it was a traveling kind of a shelter experience. So there were like 4 congregations in the area that would welcome people,
Right.
you know, for short term. And then they decided, there was a conversation about how really needed to have one space. And out of all those congregations, Lakeview Lutheran, and with Mattas and Sandy, they were the only church that voted to have the shelter.
You're there all the time
All the
because
time.
the others didn't want to be bothered that much.
I'm not saying that part.
Sandy
I'm
told me that.
I'm just saying that was kind of the energy, and not being able to say, it wasn't a, you know, people could say, oh, we sacrificed. You know, you have to sacrifice that space if you have a shelter there. And that was never the question. I'm like,
No.
oh, so we don't have Sunday school classes, we can make that do somewhere else, or we don't have this office space.
Yeah.
That was just it was like a given.
And that seems like that was the history, too.
And that's the history.
Always
Yeah.
taking the risk and always saying, that's the right thing to do.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
Well, yeah, you stop and think with the building that you're replacing now.
Yeah.
They started out, did they own the land or did they buy the land?
Oh, that's a story.
I can't remember, but I can remember.
That's one of those hard stories.
But those people, that congregation started out and they built that church. There was literally, I mean, there was not an existing structure on this
No.
land. They literally built that up themselves, which is phenomenal
Yeah.
at any age, and you know. It's something you don't often see in this day and age at all.
Right.
But they had built that church.
Yeah.
And as you said, it goes all the way back
Right.
to the very beginning in 1848 with the very first pastor, Paul Anderson, who laid that foundation of being welcoming and kind of appreciative of what people in transition are going through. They were one of the first churches that did worship in English because they were reaching out to the immigrant community.
Right.
And wanted and recognized that people needed to learn English in order to survive and to thrive. And so they started right away, you know, that kind of outreach to
Right.
immigrants.
In fact,
Hello,
you brought
it
that.
all comes around.
Yeah.
I was going through some an old suitcase I had with papers and stuff in, and I found my old membership packet, by the way, from when I was joining the church. And in there, as part of the history, I remember reading that they were down, it was on it, downtown someplace, the congregation opened up their basement, their church, to survivors of the Chicago fire, the people, homeless people that lost everything. They opened their doors even back then to,
Yeah.
Yeah. It's been the history.
That's
It has been the
baked into
history.
it, yeah.
Yeah.
they've always done something like that, it
Yeah.
seems like we were reading at the time.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, and I think it's just thinking about what's happening with the arrivals of all the migrants in Chicago right now, and it's such a big difference between supporting something on paper and then following through and having it be right across the street, having it be in your basement.
In your face.
Yeah, exactly. And that's something that I think not a lot of places are willing to do. Not a lot of people are willing to sit with, to have it be right there and to be accepting of that and be okay with whatever repercussions are there. Maybe that's not the right word, but I feel like that's something that Lakeview does really well, is just taking action and actually being there face to face and not just on paper.
And this, I was going to say, this next move too is built on all of these saints. You know, the idea, I mean, of even before you were there, these discussions with the Mattas and Penny, I mean, so many of the people we've talked about housing. You know, what do we do with this space? You know, what's the best way to minister, to be in the community? And so for this to be the next step is just amazing that it's carrying on right through all of the history of all of the people who found their home there are now making more homes, you know, to continue to do what all of the qualities that we just talked about that draws people to Lakeview, the safe, wonderful, warm place that also has a mission, right, to look beyond.
I come from the other side, because I lived in the basement, and it's home.
Yeah.
Even now, it's still home.
Yeah, yeah. I think what I appreciate is that when you start having these hard conversations or challenging conversations or wondering conversations, it's generally it's not why should we do it, but why wouldn't we do it? Like what would stand in our way of completing this journey or this project the way we, imagine it needs to be or could be. So it's just it's a tweak, but it feels always a lot more proactive.
Sure.
Right?
Yep.
Then reactive. Oh, we can't do it. Oh, why wouldn't we do it?
Right.
That's when they came to us in May about the migrants across the street, and we were all sitting there, and they said, "Oh, we need a place to, bring supplies. Wonder where that could be." And we just kind of all looked at each other. Well, why wouldn't we?
Exactly.
The building is empty. Oh, we need somebody to kind of help raise money. Well, why wouldn't we? So. It's a wonderful, it's in our DNA, in other words.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah. Well, I'm glad we're kind of talking about as we wrap up here, just about the beginnings of the building and then where we are now, and obviously as we're getting ready to, making some progress and getting ready to take down the building and then build up a new structure and what that will look like. But just the importance, and I'm so glad that we just have this starting conversation and starting to get down some of these stories. I think it's just so important to have these things down and have these things recorded, especially at a time like this, as we're transitioning from one building and one space and one, maybe not one generation, but a couple of generations into the next era. I think is so important. And another thing that I've been thinking about over the past couple of weeks, and just something that you and I have talked about, is just how when we're thinking about these stories of people in the church, but also just in general. You walk through the cemetery, or just someone you see walking down the street, and it's just incredible how many stories are out there. Like walking through a cemetery, and all these people that just have so many stories, and so many experiences in their lives, and it's just great that we're able to sit down and talk about some of these people and make that happen. Right.
We were talking about this when we went to visit. One of the things I used to say to Sandy, and yes, I go by notebooks, say to Sandy, you should go to the dollar store, get yourself a couple of notebooks, and start writing some of these things down, so that they will be here. And it won't, we rely upon, people like us who remember things. And I'm sure there are things that we don't, that we don't recall, that they're gone. Sandy's gone, and they're gone with her. So this is kind of like, it's sort of a history now.
Yeah.
And yes, Nadine, I will go to the dollar store by myself.
I'll even buy them for you, Joe.
And I didn't say before, but thank you, Zachariah, for doing this, because I think for those of us who are not Amatis, I mean, a part of what we would hope out of these conversations is to not only be able to tell our stories, but then to kind of hear new generations of people for whom church, community looks really different from this. And so I think it's intriguing, and we do well to not just share our stories, but to also then to listen to. We need to listen to some of these stories and how they impact new generations of people who are trying to discern and figure out what it means to be faithful people, what it means to be spiritual people, what it means to be in community, what all of those things can look like, going forward.
Yeah.
It is such a shift. I mean, church now for so many people, and even Lakeview, is so much different from 10 years ago, 20 years ago.
Yes.
So it is big shifts happening for sure. Yeah.
And from the voice of experience, there are other congregations out here that are not friendly. We talked about this one time. That are not generally friendly toward newcomers or any people. That way. That they may practice. They may talk about being extending open arms and doing all this.
Right.
Difference between talking and doing.
Sure. Yeah. Exactly. All right. Well, thank you guys for being here. Thank you for sharing your stories. I very much appreciate it, and I know everyone who's listening and watching is going to enjoy this very, very much. And hopefully we continue to get these stories down and have these conversations. But again, thank you for being here.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.